Before we gavel the hearing in, I would just like to remind audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated. Although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is certainly permissible, holding up signs during the proceedings, that is not permissible. So any disruptions will result in a suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. With that, I'd like to call us to order here for our hearing this morning, and ask all the members to take their seats if you could. On September the 3rd, North Korea detonated a nuclear device that, according to news reports, was stronger than all of the previous tests combined. This hydrogen bomb represents the latest advancement in North Korea's long-running nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile programs, which now pose an urgent threat to the United States. Moreover, the apparent speed in which these North Korean advancements have occurred are challenging the security structure across East Asia, creating dangerous instability in the region, and that instability will likely be dealing with for decades to come. So today this committee is going to discuss the tools that must be deployed and fully utilized to address these threats. And I believe the response from the United States and our allies should be supercharged. We need to use every ounce of leverage. When I had breakfast this morning with Secretary Tillerson, we laid out these issues. That leverage includes sanctions. It includes diplomacy. It includes projecting information into North Korea to put maximum pressure on this rogue regime. Time is running out. And let's be clear, sanctions can still have an important impact. North Korea's advanced weapons programs rely on foreign-sourced technology. Much of these programs are made outside the country. North Korea pays an inordinate amount of money, and it has to have hard currency to do it, to run this very expensive ICBM program and this nuclear weapons program. Since it requires hard currency, that is the Achilles heel. Unfortunately, years have been wasted as sanctions have been weak, allowing North Korea to access financial resources and build its nuclear and missile programs. Any sanction that crimps North Korea's access to technology is urgently needed. Congress has done its part to ramp up economic pressure. We passed a North Korea Sanctions Act last February, authored by myself and Mr. Elliot Engel, our ranking member. In July, we increased the tools at the administration's disposal as part of the big sanctions package that we passed here, including sanctions on North Korea and Russia and the Iran missile program. Part of that included targeting North Korean slave labor exports. Part of it, again, refined some of the focus on banking, and part of it also was focused on exports to ports around the world from North Korea. In August, the administration secured a major victory with the unanimous adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2371, which Ambassador Haley called the strongest sanctions ever imposed in response to a ballistic missile test. She is now hard at work on another resolution. To be effective, these tools need to be implemented aggressively. The administration deserves credit for increasing the pace of designations, and I appreciate Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's statements that more are coming. But we need to dramatically ramp up the number of North Korea-related designations. These designations do not require Beijing's cooperation. We can designate Chinese banks and companies unilaterally, giving them a choice between doing business with North Korea or the United States. And I would just observe that not doing business with the United States for many of these companies would risk bankruptcy for these institutions. Earlier this year, Treasury sanctioned the Bank of Dandong, a regional Chinese bank. And that's a good start. But we must target major Chinese banks doing business with North Korea, such as China Merchants Bank, and even big state-owned banks like the Agricultural Bank of China. They have a significant presence in the United States. And if they do not stop doing business with North Korea, they should be sanctioned now. It's not just China. We should go after banks and companies in any countries that do business with North Korea the same way. Just as we press China to enforce UN sanctions banning imports of North Korea coal and iron and seafood, we should press countries to end all trade with North Korea. This grave nuclear risk demands it. Sanctions are not the only way to apply pressure on the regime. We must maintain a united front with our allies. I just returned from South Korea, where people are on edge. We were there when the missile was launched over Japan. It doesn't matter if you're talking to government officials there, or the business community, or the average person on the street. They all understand the threat. So I'm pleased that the THAAD missile defense system has been fully deployed. I'm also pleased that the administration is strengthening regional deterrence through additional U.S. arms sales to Japan and South Korea, which we discussed this morning. Finally, we need to do much better at getting information into North Korea so that North Koreans can better understand the brutality and corruption of the self-serving Kim regime. And these efforts are already pressuring the regime, creating some unrest, increasing defections from North Korea, but I'm afraid here our efforts grade poorly. International broadcasting and fomenting dissent just have not been a priority, and that's unacceptable in this situation. While we should take a diplomatic approach to North Korea, the reality is that this regime will never be at peace with its people, its neighbors, or us. And now is the time to apply that pressure. With that said, let me turn to the ranking member of our committee, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. You and I have worked together for a long time on the Korean situation. We had a hearing on this topic to start the year. This committee's worked in a bipartisan manner to advance some of the toughest sanctions ever on North Korea, which are now U.S. law. Yesterday, the United Nations Security Council unanimously agreed to Resolution 2375 in response to the Kim regime's sixth nuclear test, and we're revisiting the threat of North Korea today so we can hear directly from the administration. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for your unwavering leadership on this issue. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and thank you for your service. Acting Assistant Secretary Thornton, I have tremendous confidence in you and our other Korea diplomats, but it's hard to believe that nearly 8 months into this administration, there is no nominee for Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. The same goes for our Ambassador to South Korea, Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and a range of other senior State Department officials. This administration has said that North Korea is its top foreign policy priority. But between the President's dangerous and irresponsible communication on the matter and the inexplicable reluctance to get personnel in place, he is, in my opinion, undercutting his own peaceful pressure strategy. I view the Kim regime's nuclear program as the single greatest threat to American national security and to global security. Right now, we need all hands on deck and focused on the same objective. We do that here in this committee. But that objective, of course, also gets to one of the main questions. While we all share the desire to rid North Korea of nuclear weapons, some have said that Kim will never give them up, regardless of the pressure. I've been to North Korea twice, Mr. Chairman, as you know, and I can tell you and everybody else that this is not a regime that looks at the world the way any other government does. The Kim regime is bent on self-preservation above all else and is very willing to sacrifice their own people to achieve that end. That makes them obviously incredibly dangerous. The military options in a North Korea contingency are incredibly grim, and it's hard to overstate just how devastating a conflict on the Korean Peninsula would be. If this conflict escalates into a war, we could be measuring the cost in millions of lives lost. Time is clearly running out. Once the regime in Pyongyang possesses nuclear weapons that can strike the United States, it will immediately raise questions about the validity of our security commitments to our alliance partners, Japan and South Korea. Nuclear capabilities of this kind would likely embolden the North Koreans to engage in other bad behavior, such as harassment of our allies and continued proliferation of nuclear technologies. Some even speculate that the Kim regime might even seek reunification of the peninsula on its own terms. So we need a smart strategy, first and all, and then deft and consistent execution of that strategy, and obviously that's no easy task. Administrations of both parties were unable to put a stop to North Korea's nuclear program. North Korea detonated its first nuclear weapon in 2006, and a few years later the Bush administration removed North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism list as an inducement to join the six-party talks. Since Kim Jong-un assumed power, bomb and missile tests have increased in frequency, and this year, since the start of the Trump administration, we've seen an alarming increase in the frequency and significance of tests, and of course the detonation a few weeks ago of what appears to be a thermonuclear device. So where do we go from here? Personally, I agree with Secretary of Defense Mattis that we're, quote, never out of diplomatic solutions when it comes to North Korea, although I'm not sure President Trump shares that view. Frankly, I'm not sure he even knows what his views are on this. At present, however, Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to be anywhere close to sitting down for talks of any kind, much less sincere negotiations. The first order of business should be to have a moratorium on testing to halt the progress of North Korea's nuclear program. Our objective has long been a denuclearized North Korea, and we cannot lose sight of that aim. In my view, we have not exhausted economic pressure through sanctions, and we need to do all we can to keep pressure up on the Kim regime. But at the same time we increase pressure, we must also ramp up coordination with our allies. We must demonstrate that defensive military measures are at the ready, both to reassure our allies and to deter the regime from any action that could lead to deadly escalation. I'm interested in hearing from our witnesses today about how we're going to pursue those aims. Under ordinary circumstances, I would say this is a tall order, but I have to say again, the President's behavior surrounding this crisis is making the situation even more challenging. Outrageous red lines like threats of fire and fury, shaming our allies through tweets, inconsistently from one day to the next about Kim Jong-un or China or our economic partnership with South Korea, picking a fight with South Korea right at this time, loose talk about expanding America's nuclear arsenal and the proliferation of these devastating weapons. All these actions undermine the credibility of the office of the President and the credibility of the U.S. government, effectively undermining U.S. leadership and driving a wedge between Washington and our friends, creating grave uncertainty with China, whose cooperation we need, and with North Korea, whose leader is, as we know, single-minded and ruthless. Our country faces a serious national security challenge, and we need principled and visionary leadership. We need to be standing with our allies, acting with integrity, and reaffirming our commitments. The President needs to lead on the global stage, pushing China and Russia to enforce sanctions effectively, and building consensus about a path forward, not waiting to see who does what next and then reacting with the first words that come to mind. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what American leadership should look like in this crisis, and how we find the right path forward. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. We have with us Ms. Susan Thornton, Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian Affairs at the Department of State. And as a career member of the Foreign Service, she has spent the last 20 years working on U.S. policy in Europe and Asia, focused on the countries of the former Soviet Union and on East Asia. Assistant Secretary Marshall Billingsley is the Assistant Secretary in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Department of the Treasury. Mr. Billingsley previously served as Managing Director of Business Intelligence Services for Deloitte, where he focused on illicit finance. And so we welcome both our witnesses to the committee. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and all members here are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any additional questions of you or any extraneous material for the record. And with that, I would just suggest, and we'll begin with you, Assistant Secretary Thornton, if you could summarize your remarks, and then we'll go to Mr. Billingsley, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the ever-increasing challenge that North Korea poses. The threat posed by North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear program is grave. North Korea's 6th nuclear test on September 3rd is an unacceptable provocation that ignores repeated calls from the international community for a change in their behavior. It followed the August 28th ballistic missile launch that overflew portions of Hokkaido, Japan, and 2 ICBM launches in July. These provocations represent a tangible threat to the security of Japan and South Korea, our allies, and to the entire globe. We cannot allow such flagrant violations of international law to continue. North Korea has also made dramatic threats regarding its ability to hit Guam and other parts of the United States. Secretary of Defense Mattis has made clear that we have the ability to defend ourselves and our allies from any attack, and that our commitments to our allies remain ironclad. This administration, though, has developed a clear strategy of applying international pressure to hold Pyongyang to account. First, we continue to push for strong UN sanctions. Last night, the UN Security Council passed another significant set of international sanctions, the second set of sanctions in the last 2 months, unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. Second, we're using our domestic laws to impose sanctions on individuals and entities that enable the DPRK's illicit activities. Third, we are pressing countries to fully implement the UN Security Council resolutions and sanctions and to harmonize their domestic sanctions regimes with those Security Council designations. Fourth, we're urging the international community to cease normal political interactions with the DPRK and increase its diplomatic isolation. And fifth, we're calling on countries to cut trade ties with Pyongyang to choke off revenue sources that finance the regime's weapons programs. Even as we pursue denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, deterrence, as was mentioned by the ranking member, is a central part of our strategy. We have deployed the THAAD anti-missile system to the Republic of Korea and continue to take other measures to prepare ourselves to respond to any DPRK attack, whether on the United States, South Korea, or Japan, with overwhelming force. We've been clear we're not seeking regime change or collapse in North Korea, and we do not seek accelerated reunification or an excuse to send troops north of the demilitarized zone. We do seek peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a North Korea that stops belligerent actions and is not presenting a threat to the United States or our allies. We recognize that the success of this pressure strategy will depend on cooperation from international partners, especially China. and we are clear-eyed in viewing China's growing, if uneven, support for international measures against the DPRK. China has taken some notable steps on implementing sanctions, but we would like to see them do more. We continue to engage with China and Russia to further pressure the DPRK, but if they do not act, we will use the tools at our disposal. Just last month, we rolled out new sanctions targeting Russian and Chinese individuals and entities that were doing illicit trade with North Korea. So while there is more work to be done, we do see encouraging signs of progress on increasing the pressure on the North Korean regime. Countries spanning the globe have issued strong statements against the ICBM tests and the most recent nuclear tests. We've seen countries expel sanctioned North Korean officials, prevent certain individuals from entering their jurisdictions, reduce the size of North Korean diplomatic missions in their countries, and cancel or downgrade diplomatic engagements or exchanges. Just in the recent days, we've had 2 announcements by 2 countries, Mexico and Egypt, about their efforts to downgrade relations with North Korea. Countries have halted visa issuances to North Korean laborers and are phasing out the use of these workers. South Korea, Japan, and Australia have implemented unilateral national sanctions against targeted entities and individuals, and European partners are collaborating with us on maximizing pressure on the DPRK. Unfortunately, despite all of this, we've yet to see a notable change in the DPRK's dangerous behavior or signs that is interested in credible talks on denuclearization. We will continue to step up efforts to sanction individuals and entities, enabling the DPRK regime and its weapons programs. Following the nuclear test, we are pressing hard for a new Security Council resolution, which of course was adopted last night, and we hope that these new sectoral sanctions, including textiles, provisions on oil, provisions on shipping, et cetera, will allow us to increase our pressure. China and Russia should continue to exert their unique leverage, of course, on the DPRK, and it should be clear that we will never accept North Korea as a nuclear state. We'll continue to work within our alliances to develop additional defense measures to protect the people of the United States and also of our allies. And at the same time, we will not lose sight of the plight of the 3 remaining U.S. citizens who have been unjustly detained by North Korea, nor of the regime's egregious human rights violations. We will continue to reiterate our willingness to resolve this issue through diplomacy, and if the DPRK indicates an interest in serious engagement, we will explore that option, but with clear eyes about the DPRK's past track record of violating negotiated agreements. Thank you again for letting me testify today, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to update you on the measures that the Treasury Department is undertaking in concert with the Department of State and the broader administration efforts to deal with the unacceptable provocations and threats posed by North Korea. In order to constrain Kim Jong-un, the international community has unanimously enacted multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. In fact, with each provocation by North Korea's dictator, the nations of the world have responded with steadily tightening constraints of sanctions and embargoes. Under previous administrations, the United Nations had already prohibited trade in matters such as arms, luxury goods, minerals, monuments, and the maintenance of offices and subsidiaries and bank accounts in North Korea. And while this had clearly inhibited North Korea's quest for weapons of mass destruction, it was not enough. On August 5th, our administration worked with the other permanent members of the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 2371, striking at the core of North Korea's revenue generation. That resolution, drafted by the United States, embargoes all importation of North Korean coal, iron, lead, and seafood, now requires nations to cap employment of North Korean citizens sent abroad as slave labor. Very importantly, last night, under Ambassador Haley's leadership, the United States passed with the UN Security Council Resolution 2375, which now targets North Korea's few remaining sources of revenue. Very importantly, the export of textiles. It further restricts North Korea's ability to acquire revenue from overseas slave labor, and it cuts off about 55% of the refined petroleum products that are going into North Korea. and it bans further joint ventures with that regime. These two recent resolutions are central to our efforts to mobilize the international community and to deny funds to Kim Jong-un's weapons programs. The fact, however, is that North Korea has been living under UN sanctions for over a decade, and it has nevertheless made significant strides towards its goal of building a nuclear-tipped ICBM. As is the case with any international agreement, the effectiveness of UN Security Council resolutions depends upon implementation and enforcement. Kim Jong-un has two key financial vulnerabilities, which we are targeting in the Treasury Department. First, he needs revenue to maintain and expand his WMD and ballistic missile programs. And second, he needs access to the international financial system to acquire the hard currency that Chairman Royce mentioned, to transfer funds, and to pay for goods, both licit and illicit. There are only a number of finite ways that North Korea can raise significant amounts of foreign exchange, and for many years, coal has been the center of gravity for revenue generation. By our estimates, prior to the latest UN Security Council resolutions, coal shipments brought in more than $1 billion a year to the regime. North Korea was making an additional $500 million or so from iron, lead, and seafood, and the textile ban will deny them around $800 million that they were generating in previous years. This is why these resolutions are so important. Again, effective implementation of this and all of the prior UN Security Council resolutions is essential. Consistent with this, on August 22nd, we struck at the heart of North Korea's illegal coal trade with China. Treasury designated 16 individuals and entities, including 3 Chinese companies that are among the largest importers of North Korean coal. We estimate that collectively these companies were responsible for importing nearly $500 million worth of North Korean coal between 2013 and 2016. In doing this, we sent 2 clear messages. The first was to North Korea. We intend to deny the regime its last remaining sources of revenue unless and until it reverses course and denuclearizes. The second message was to China. We are capable of tracking North Korea's trade in banned goods, such as coal, despite elaborate evasion schemes, and we will act even if the Chinese government will not. On June 1st of this year, we targeted a different type of North Korean revenue, labor. We designated 3 individuals and 6 entities involved in that set of actions. We also took actions in March. In total, under this administration, the Treasury Department is engaged in a full-court press on Kim Jong-un's revenue generation networks, and we have singled out 37 specific entities involving the most lucrative types of trade. Mr. Chairman, I want to share with you today another type of evasion scheme in which North Korea is engaged. As part of their efforts to acquire revenue, the regime employs deceptive shipping practices to conceal the true origin of goods. Pyongyang falsifies the identity of vessels to make it harder for governments to determine if ships docking in their ports are linked to North Korea. And despite this evasion, we will expose the individuals and companies that are providing insurance, maintenance, or other services to North Korean vessels. For instance, in June, we designated Dalian Global Unity, a Chinese company that apparently was transferring about 700,000 tons of freight annually between China and North Korea. I'm pleased to provide with the committee today additional exposures of these duplicitous actions. The intelligence community has provided to your committee today evidence of how vessels originate in China, they turn off their transponders as they move into North Korean waters, they dock at North Korean ports, and they onload commodities such as coal. They keep those transponders off, and then they turn them back on as they round the South Korean peninsula, and they head into a Russian port. In this particular case, this vessel, MV by May 8, registered in St. Kitts and Nevis, sat in that Russian port for a period of time and then headed back out to water, ultimately docking back in China with North Korean origin coal. Sanctions evasion. The second slide, which we'll show now, is yet another example. In this particular example, you have a vessel that pulled into North Korea, kept its transponder off in violation of international maritime law, docked in Russia, offloaded the North Korean coal. Another vessel, that one was Panamanian, another vessel from Jamaica, Jamaican flag, pulled in, picked up the North Korean coal, and headed straight to China, again, to circumvent UN sanctions. Mr. Chairman, the other prong of our effort is to close in on the way North Korea seeks to access the international financial system. Because of the sanctions regimes we have in place, it is difficult for North Korean individuals and entities to do business in their true names. And so that is why they maintain representatives abroad who are engaged in all manner of obfuscation of creation of shell and front companies. In fact, I dealt with many of these entities when I served in the private sector, to help conceal North Korea's overseas footprint. These individuals are crucial to the North Korean regime because they have the expertise needed to establish front companies, open bank accounts, and conduct transactions to move and launder funds. It is incumbent upon the financial services industry, both here and abroad, to stay vigilant. And I urge those who might be implicated in the establishment or shell or front companies for the DPRK, or anyone who is aware of such entities, to come forward with that information now, before they find themselves swept up in our net. We are closing in on North Korea's trade representatives. This year, we've already designated several bank and trading operatives in China, Cuba, Russia, and Vietnam. And we're closely coordinating with the Department of Justice and others to target these various North Korean networks that are transferring funds. The chairman mentioned our actions against the Bank of Dandong. We have designated that bank under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act and found it to be of a primary money laundering concern and issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. Again, I recognize that I'm over time with the committee, and therefore I will wrap up my comments, but suffice to say that our actions, this was the first Treasury Department action in over a decade that targeted a non-North Korean bank for facilitating North Korean financial activity. It demonstrates our commitment to take action. We look forward to taking action with the Chinese where possible, and in the event that that is not possible, we will nevertheless move forward to safeguard the U.S. and international financial system. Thank you, Chairman.
Assistant Secretary Billingsley, thank you very much. Let me make a point. In terms of when we've seen sanctions that were effective, in 2005, we had the sanctions on Banco Delta Asia. At that point in time, in talking to a senior defector who had worked in their missile program, he indicated that because we had cut off the hard currency, they had to shut down their ICBM program. One of the things he indicated also, or was indicated by the conversations we had with senior defectors, was that during that period of time, the ability of the regime, or the dictator as they called him, to get his hands on hard currency was blocked. And the inability of a dictator to be able to pay his generals, and this was the quote, is a very bad position for a dictator to be in. In retrospect, we therefore see two things happened during that period of time in terms of the desperation of the situation within the Kim regime. This was under his father, Kim Jong-il. We have the ability to replicate that if we have the will to do what was done in 2005. And in 2005, it was maybe a dozen banks that were being used. At that time, Treasury found that North Korea was counterfeiting $100 U.S. bills, and that gave Treasury the authority to do this until such time as the Department of State forced them to lift the asset freezes. But during that time, we had an enormous amount of pressure being brought to bear. In this particular case, and let me use your words here, but it is China that is primarily involved in the support system in terms of, I'd estimate, 90% of the hard currency that the regime needs. Now, we've managed to cut off a lot of that because it's very expensive to run an ICBM program or a nuclear weapons program. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. North Korea's money has no value. So they have to get this foreign currency into the country in order to pay for it on a month-to-month basis in terms of what they're trying to build out. You said if China wishes to avoid future measures such as those imposed on Bank of Dandong or the various companies sanctioned for illegal trade practices, then it urgently needs to take demonstrable public steps to eliminate North Korea's trade and financial access. That's the point to us here in Congress. Some of our opinion on this in terms of Congress is affected by the fact that China's biggest banks, even state-owned banks, still do business with North Korea. That's got to end completely. We cannot accept half measures on this. These transactions are what supports the regime's nuclear program. And I understand the administration is pressing Beijing to take action here. I understand that many of these banks have significant operations in the United States and that there would be consequences to our economy. However, these banks' U.S. presence is the very thing that makes our sanctions so powerful. They'd rather do business with us than North Korea in terms of how consequential that is to these institutions. So at what point do we designate these major Chinese banks for doing business with North Korea? We've done our outreach to Beijing with limited results. Shouldn't we demonstrate the seriousness with which we take the North Korean nuclear threat while further isolating that regime in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, from the financial system that he uses to build out his atomic weapons program?
Chairman, first let me say that China and Russia are to be recognized for supporting the adoption of the two most recent UN Security Council resolutions, which are significant for the clampdown that they enable us to place on Kim Jong-un's revenue. However, we've been very clear that if China wishes to avoid further measures such as that which happened to the Bank of Dandong, we urgently need to see demonstrable action. I cannot tell the committee today that we've seen sufficient evidence of China's willingness to truly shut down North Korean revenue flows, to expunge North Korean illicit actors from its banking system, or to expel the various North Korean middlemen and brokers who are continuing to establish webs of front companies. We need to see that happen.
Well, and let me just, to both our assistant secretaries, say this. Last night we saw the Security Council unanimously approve its third UN sanctions resolution this year on North Korea, and this latest measure restricts the regime's oil imports while banning textile exports and joint ventures. However, the nature of the Security Council means that this was a compromise. To ensure the regime cannot claim this compromise that came out of this as a victory, which is what they'll try to do, we've got to demonstrate the impact of these new international sanctions by making certain that this time no one's skirting those sanctions. So what steps will the Departments of State and Treasury take in the coming days to implement the new Security Council resolution, and how will these actions that you're about to take send this clear message to Kim Jong-un on the reality that this time we are going to follow through with enforcement and give them no space in terms of additional hard currency?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very clear in the process of ramping up this peaceful pressure campaign on the North Korean regime that one of the key elements is to keep the global coalition that we've got behind these sanctions together and to keep every single country in the coalition working actively to continue to squeeze on trade, on laborers, on financial transactions, on shipping, et cetera. And what we've been doing in the Department of State is working across the board with every one of our diplomatic partners around the world. The Secretary raises the North Korea issue in every single one of his meetings with foreign leaders. And we have seen a great response from countries around the world who are increasingly outraged over North Korea's provocative behavior. So we have really been working hard to close the net. We've seen diplomatic establishments closed, ambassadors kicked out, other North Korean representatives kicked out, all kinds of the Philippines announced recently they're going to cut completely trade with North Korea. So we are having an effect on a lot of the networks that the North Koreans have built around the world. I think the sanctions 2371 last month and now 2375 last night, we are going to be working aggressively to make sure that we and all of our partners around the world, too, are working with every country that we can to make sure that every country has the capacity to track illicit transactions, to go after violators and raising consciousness, but both also giving them the tools to go after those bad actors is what we're focused on. We're trying to clean up ship registries and give countries the ability to do track better the shipping of ships that are flagged under their flag, et cetera. So I think we're still working on implementing these most recent 2 UN Security Council resolutions. We also have an ongoing, very close dialogue with the Chinese on what they're doing to track sanctions, and we share a lot of information with them, but we will also drive them to shut down networks that we find.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Thornton. My time's expired. I'm going to go to Mr. Engel for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when I was in North Korea, and this is a while back, but twice, one of the things struck me. We had just deposed Saddam Hussein, and one of the top North Korean officials, it wasn't the leader, but it was very high-ranking official, said to us, Saddam Hussein didn't have nuclear weapons, and look where he is now. From those 2 trips I took, that's the one thing that rang in my ears. And now, of course, they're carrying out those horrific words. Let me, Secretary Thornton, let me ask you. In Europe, we have NATO, obviously. In Asia, we don't have a treaty group like NATO. So how do we reassure, in your view, our allies who doubt our resolve to defend Tokyo or Seoul because we're afraid of what might happen in Los Angeles or Guam or any other place? How do we reassure them, our allies?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I think we have been working very, very closely with both South Korea and Japan, but also with all the other countries in the Asia-Pacific region on confronting the North Korea challenge. We work, obviously, we have a very close and continuing conversation with both Japan and Korea, not just the State Department, but the Department of Defense on managing our alliances. Obviously, we've been talking to both Japan and Korea, as the chairman mentioned, about additional defensive needs and capabilities that they may have that they want to move ahead on. And so I think the reassurance that we've been providing them with and the constant close communication with them and with others in the region has been of significant reassurance to them about our ongoing commitment to the defense of our allies.
Thank you very much. Secretary Billingsley, can the U.S. And could you identify the top, say, 25 firms that compose North Korea's illicit network, and if so, would you be willing to provide that information to this committee in classified form if necessary?
Ranking Member, yes, we would be pleased to have a classified discussion with you on a number of North Korean entities that we are actively targeting. However, once we choose to move with designations and blocking of assets and so forth, we would want to keep that kind of information very close hold until we're ready to move so that the money doesn't flee in advance of our actions.
Okay, I think there would be interest in this committee for such a gathering, so we'll be in touch with you. We'll do it together, the chairman and I. Let me ask you about these entities. If Beijing and the other relevant governments haven't taken sufficient action to close these entities and curb their activities, have we taken action to designate these entities under U.S. law?
Yes, sir, we have. We've done a couple of waves of that under this administration. Our August 22nd actions that I referenced were probably the most noteworthy and are definitely a signal of things to come.
Have we informed Beijing? These entities operate, it's my understanding these entities operate in China and a small number other jurisdictions. Have we informed Beijing of the activities of these entities and communicated the expectation of the U.S. government that their actions be curbed?
Yes, sir. Both the Department of the Treasury and the Department of State are in repeated communications with our counterparts in China, often very specifically with respect to entities that we believe are associated with the North Korean regime, and we make very specific requests for action on these entities.
Thank you. Look, this is a problem that goes back to a number of administrations before this one. But the president didn't inherit a complex and intractable foreign policy problem in North Korea, but his mixed and inconsistent messaging is self-inflicted. It's a self-inflicted wound. Again, I don't see the purpose of arguing with South Korea on trade at a time when we need to show strong and resolve. So let me ask you this. I have so many questions to ask, I can never get them in a short period of time. But let me go back to you, Secretary Billingsley. The chairman mentioned several large Chinese banks in his remarks. China Merchants Bank was one of them. Have we taken action against them? And if we haven't, why haven't we?
So, Congressman, we have taken action against Bank of Dandong, as was discussed earlier, right, which we believe is a money laundering concern associated with North Korea. And our actions have had a very clear effect on that bank's operations. That is a signal of our intent to move forward with expunging from the international financial system any financial institution which is taking insufficient action from an anti-money laundering standpoint against North Korea. We believe that the next most important thing to do here is to very specifically target and expose those individuals who are the financial facilitators for the North Korean regime, who set up these elaborate front and shell company structures, which are then used to get the bank accounts to launder the money. And that is a priority focus area for us, and we are driving very, very quickly forward on that matter.
Thank you. Secretary Thornton, did you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I just wanted to note for the committee that the Chinese have announced in the last couple of days measures against all of their big banks operating, particularly in Northeast China, issuing warnings and prohibitions about opening accounts for North Korean actors. So they are actually feeling some pressure on this and making public statements.
Yeah, one quick thing. You both would agree that any kind of resolution or partial resolution of this crisis has to go through China, that it's virtually impossible to not involve China. China, I think we all think, is the one country that can influence North Korean behavior. Do you both of you agree with that?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey, whose subcommittee leads our work on human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for putting together this important hearing. And I do want to thank our distinguished witnesses for painstakingly working the details of this. It's an extremely difficult fight, and I want to thank you for what you're doing every day to make a difference. I also want to express my deepest respect to Ambassador Haley and the administration for drafting UN Resolution 2375, as you have pointed out, the toughest sanctions ever meted out against North Korea. My hope is that China and Russia will comply with the terms and conditions, and you might want to speak to your expectations about that, because obviously in the past it's been lackluster in many ways. I would also appreciate your thoughts on how you judge the success or failure of strategic patience, and whether or not you thought that aided and got us to where we're at now, or was this inevitable anyway? For many, there is a significant, and I think a profoundly significant, underappreciation for Juche, the dictatorship cult, deification of Kim Il-sung. I've read books about it. I've talked to many of the diaspora and refugees who speak and they say, you Americans don't get it. The worship of Kim Il-sung is so profound, so deeply embedded, and it does lead to a fanaticism that rivals ISIS-like fanaticism about what they would do for their leader, the great leader going back and now to the current leader. And I think if we underappreciate that, do you think an information surge, there's nothing that precludes us from broadcasting, despite jamming capabilities that they might have, even more to demystify the Kims, because the big lie has certainly been embedded in the hearts and minds of so many North Koreans for so long. Every time I talk to a group of defectors, and I ask them that question, they wax eloquent about how from the youngest age right up, and those expressions when one of the leaders die, and the tears and people throwing themselves on the ground, it's not fake. It's fanaticism, and when it comes to the military, that means that fanaticism will be carried out with horrific consequences for those that are defending liberty in South Korea and elsewhere. And finally, we know that China subsidizes North Korea's bad behavior. It enables torture of asylum seekers by repatriating those who escape to China in direct contravention of the Refugee Convention, and provides Kim Jong-un needed currency by employing thousands of trafficked workers. And I'm wondering if the department is looking at, with regards to China, imposing Magnitsky-like, global Magnitsky sanctions against those who are complicit in those crimes. Even the UN Commission on Inquiry for North Korea recommended that sanctions be used to target individuals. We've got the law, and I hope that's something that is under active consideration, and hopefully we'll hear soon about individuals being so targeted. Ms. Thornton.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, of course, the U.S. State Department has been very concerned about the egregious human rights situation in North Korea for decades. We've had a special representative working on these issues. We've worked very closely with him. I think we've made some good progress, or at least we've taken a number of very significant actions in this area, and we'll continue to do so. I think the question of increasing information access inside North Korea is one that we certainly have looked at and are working on, and whether we can do more there. I think we're always looking at whether we can do more and what we can do more effectively. But I think from my standpoint, one of the biggest ways we can get people inside North Korea to question what the regime is doing is by making it very difficult for them to pay the military and to provide for their citizens. And I think that's really what we're very focused on, in addition to trying to knock down the proliferation networks that are contributing to the weapons program. So, I mean, there's a litany of egregious behavior across the board, and we want to go after every single aspect of that. But I think, looking at cutting off the economic flows to North Korea is another way of
And of course, that would include the complicity of Tehran, Iran, with the ballistic missile program in North Korea.
Sorry, I didn't get the connection.
the cooperation between the Iranians and Pyongyang when it comes to ballistic missiles, is that something? It's something that I and others asked questions at when the Iran deal was being contemplated, and unfortunately that was left off the table in the final agreement. But the concern is that cooperation continues today. And I hope that that's something that's very aggressively being pursued as well.
Yeah, we're certainly looking at that.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't want to speak to Joe Che, or we're just
Well, let me.
please.
Let
Thank
me.
you.
So, first of all, Congressman, I had your leadership on human rights matters has been for quite a long time. I had a chance to work for you when I was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee back in the 1990s under Chairman Helms in those days. And again, appreciate the stand that you take on these matters. We are very specifically looking at a number of individuals in North Korea who are engaged in egregious, outrageous human rights abuses. This matter of Juche, I think you've articulated it exactly correctly. However, I'm not sure that the cult of personality necessarily extends to all of the elites right around the dear leader. He very much, I think, depends upon this hard currency revenue, as the chairman has noted. to maintain his opulent lifestyle and that of the people around him. And so the extent to which draining his ability to generate hard currency not only constricts his ability to engage in WMD and missile programs, but it also presumably increases the fragility of the regime around him. This is, as we would say, a twofer in our view.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Soon North Korea will have more nuclear weapons than they feel is absolutely necessary to defend themselves from us. But they will need hard currency. They might prefer actual cash currency. Iran is having some constraints on its ability to develop nuclear weapons. Mr. Assistant Secretary, do we have any understanding with China that nonstop flights between Pyongyang and Tehran will be forced to stop for fueling, or do we have anything else that would prevent this obvious economic deal?
I'll defer to State Department on the specific discussions on air choreo and flights in and from North Korea. I would also, Congressman, note that as we move forward on these two successive UN security...
I've got very limited time. Do we have anything or not?
I know that we have limitations on air refueling. I know the Chinese have refused to refuel, so there is pressure on...
No, I'm not asking, but I'm saying do we have any understanding with China that there'll be non-stop, no refueling planes going from Tehran to Pyongyang, loaded with currency or coming back with a nuclear weapon?
No, we don't.
We don't. Okay. So we have one country that has over $1 billion in saran wrapped hard currency, and we have another country that, if the Assistant Secretary's work is done well, will need $1 billion in currency and will have quite a number of nuclear weapons that they could sell. Folks, I've been coming to this room for 20 years, and not much has changed. We've got Ileana smiling down upon us. That's good. We've got some electronics. But for 20 years, administrations have been coming here and telling me that we don't have to make any concessions to North Korea. We don't have to do anything that would make any single American company upset. And we're going to make the American people safe. And for 20 years, I've been hearing that over and over again. I hear that we're going to have unprecedented sanctions, which means that we found a few more companies to sanction, just as they've invented a few more companies and created them. Whether we can list them faster than they can create them, I don't know. But the fact is that North Korea's real GDP has grown 50% in the last 20 years. If Assistant Secretary, if you were successful with your sanctions, you might just cause them not to increase their GDP, which means they still have 50% more than they found necessary to hold on to power back in 1997. But while we haven't made the American people safer, we've met the political objectives here in the United States. We don't threaten China, even a little bit, with country sanctions, because that would be politically difficult for the United States to do. We don't adopt reasonable objectives, like a freeze in the North Korean program, because that would be politically difficult to do. What we do is what we've been doing for 20 years. We've heard, and Chairman Royce has always come up with this or that better sanction. Sometimes his ideas are listened to, sometimes they're not. But there's never enough pressure on the North Korean regime to cause regime-threatening levels. This is a regime that survived the famines in the 1990s, late 1990s. Now their GDP is 50% higher than it has been. It's going up just about every year. And China is not going to allow us to put regime-threatening pressure on the North Korean regime. They may punish them a little bit for what they're doing and how they're doing it and how disruptive they are and how headline-grabbing they are. But, Mr. Assistant Secretary, do we even have a plan for threatening China with country sanctions, tariffs on all goods? Or is it just a matter that, well, your number 7 bank won't be able to do business in the United States, so your number 8 bank and your number 1 through 5 banks will? If you were running a retailer, would you think there was the slightest risk of your supply chain to China because of China's unwillingness to engage in the kinds of sanctions necessary just to get a freeze of the nuclear program?
Congressman, I think you raise a good point, and the chairman noted that China is central to this matter. 90% of North
And we are not doing enough to force them to change their behavior, which is to punish North Korea a little bit for being a little bit too flamboyant in their actions, but to make sure that the regime can survive. And this regime won't even agree to a freeze of their nuclear program unless you have something relatively, at least halfway, toward regimes threatening sanctions.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. We are.
You think the regime would give up its nuclear program even if they said, well, we can survive these sanctions, but we care so much about our people that we care about our GDP, we might lose the next.
I wouldn't speculate on regime thought processes. What I would focus on is the Chinese as the center of gravity here. And I think that, in fact, I know that from a tempo standpoint and from a pressure standpoint, the pace of action that we have taken, even on my brief,
it's unprecedented. Just like the last 19 years, people have sat in that chair and told me it's unprecedented. But it's certainly not been enough to stop.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I think the gentleman is raising exactly the bottom line question here. In other words, we're deferential here to a point, but it's been a long time since the 94 Framework Agreement with North Korea. It's been a long, long time of waiting for China to comply with the sanctions we pass and, frankly, with the sanctions that the United Nations pass. As you've just laid out for us with the charts that you've provided, China understands that coal is coming, circumventing the sanctions and being unloaded, just as they understand that these banks are not complying with the provisions that have been passed by the Security Council. I think that Mr. Sherman raises a point I have only seen once in 2005 in response, as I said, to North Korea counterfeiting our currency, and that power was soon taken away from the Treasury, that I ever saw anything that cut off hard currency into the regime, and that was because we didn't give anyone an option anywhere. If you were doing business, we were shutting down those institutions. So I would just say this is where the discussion needs to go next if there isn't full compliance with the sanctions that the UN have passed. Because what's at risk is our national security. And there's only one way to shut a program down with a country like North Korea that doesn't have its own revenues. And I thank the gentleman from California for raising the point. I yield back to him.
I'll just say that for 20 years, we've talked about company sanctions instead of country sanctions. For 20 years, China has carried out a policy where they smile at us, but they've done enough with North Korea so that their GDP is 50% higher in real terms. That's much better economic growth than we've achieved. So the sanctions have not prevented a high level of economic growth. And my guess is that we will continue the policies that we have in the past, perhaps at a louder volume. I would finally point out that in terms of, we've got to also remember how small the North Korean economy is, how difficult it is to squeeze. Yes, we're trying to go after their oil, but they use about the same amount of oil as 150 gas stations total, whole country. That's less than there are on Ventura Boulevard. It's going to be and of course they can liquefy their coal and use that in lieu of oil. So it's going to be tough to put this regime under enough pressure to even get a freeze. And the idea that we would ever get this regime, and having seen Saddam, having seen Gaddafi, to actually give up its nuclear weapons, I yield back.
We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California, chairman of the Europe and Eurasia Committee on Emerging Threats.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Congressman Engel for providing the leadership on this committee to be dealing with issues of this magnitude. Thank you very much for your responsible leadership. I share my colleague, Mr. Sherman's frustration and skepticism that was just expressed. Let me note my father was a Korean War veteran, and I would hope the very last thing that is on anybody's mind is to try to exercise more influence by putting more American troops in South Korea. That is not the path to a solution to this problem. And so what are the solutions? I mean, obviously we're being told, even from everything what you're saying, in terms of economic sanctions, I agree with Mr. Sherman. I'm very skeptical that any of that is going to have impact. I remember being here and sitting a little bit over there at the time when President Clinton proposed and passed through this Congress a plan that would give the North Koreans billions of dollars of American assistance. Of course, we just did that with Iranians now, too, with the same idea that we're going to take some bloodthirsty tyrants and we're going to pay them off, and by giving them some sort of aid program for their countries. So what is the solution? What is the, first of all, what's the challenge? Am I mistaken that I have heard quotes from the official head of the North Korean government threatening to rain mass destruction of some kind upon the United States? Has he actually made threats to, in some way, kill millions of Americans with a nuclear attack? I can't hear you.
I don't know if he's said those specific words, but there's certainly been a litany of threats, including at Guam, including videos showing, you know, bombs raining on American cities. So I think.
Okay, so he has made it clear that he is willing, as the leader of that country, to murder millions of Americans with the technology. Let me note then that I would hope, while we do not consider putting U.S. troops in South Korea as a solution, I would hope that we would be willing to use force, which is something that nobody seems to want to mention. And I think this is perhaps the only thing people like that understand. And so I would suggest, I won't ask what type of force has been ruled out, and I'm sure the administration has got the parameters of what type of force they're willing to use, but I would certainly think that use of defensive forces, and again, thank you, Ronald Reagan, for insisting we have anti-missile systems available. I would hope that the next time the North Koreans launch a rocket, especially one that will traverse over our ally, Japan, I would hope that we shoot it down as a message to the North Koreans and to other people like in Japan who are counting on us. And unless we demonstrate we're willing to use force, there's no reason for them to believe we will. Also, not only anti-missile defense type of approach, but I would hope that if indeed another missile is launched, that we can, or they're preparing for a launch, that we conduct a cyber attack on North Korea. And yes, it is a very small economy and a small country. A cyber attack against that type of threat should be effective, but it is a use of force without major loss of life, which is what Ronald Reagan talked about all the time. We don't want to be in a position where our alternative is murdering millions of people who are basically the victims themselves of a totalitarian regime. So I won't ask what parameters we have in the use of force, but let me just note, I don't believe that sanctions alone will have an impact on tyrants that murder their own family and have been so abusive and murderous to their own people. And I don't believe buying them off, as President Clinton tried to do. Now we are stuck with this. Down the road from that deal, we now have this. And those billions of dollars of assistance we gave North Korea, I would imagine, provided them other money that they could put into developing their own nuclear weapons system. So with that said, good luck to you all. Thank you very much. And thank you to our leadership in this committee. We're all Americans in this. Let's hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We now go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. You know, we talk a lot about bipartisanship, and we want bipartisanship on this committee and in our foreign policy, but we don't get bipartisanship when we ignore history or when we whitewash statements and actions of the current president with respect to North Korea. We have a model that works. Of course, a lot of people in this committee didn't support it, and that's called JCPOA, the Iran Nuclear Agreement. They've met the metrics. Recently, the United Nations certified they are complying. It rolled back a nuclear program. It involved cooperation, not just with our allies, but with our adversaries, Russia and China. And it had Iran at the table. To what end is U.S. policy? What I didn't hear from my friends on the other side of the aisle, including the chairman in his opening statement, a powerful opening statement, I support tougher sanctions, always have. But it's one part of a policy, not the whole policy. As the Iran experience demonstrated, there has to be some reward for compliance and cooperation at the end of the day, or you're left with a policy only of talking loudly and carrying a stick. We haven't talked about the fact, the ranking member did, that the President of the United States, in the midst of this crisis, threatened our ally, the most vulnerable party to North Korea's actions, South Korea, with abrogation of a free trade agreement we worked so hard to get. He accused the new South Korean president of appeasement. He threatened to cut off trade with any country that trades with North Korea. Well, that list is 80, including allies like India and Germany, Portugal, France, Thailand, the Philippines. Are we, in fact, going to cut off economic relations or trade with 80 nations? It's an empty threat. He talked about a response by the United States of fire and fury. But frankly, the policy looks more like fecklessness and failure. Ms. Thornton, is it the policy of the United States government to abrogate the free trade agreement with South Korea? And has anyone at the State Department looked at the negative consequences of such an action, especially at this time?
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Yes, we have looked very carefully at the Korea Free Trade Agreement, KORUS. We are currently undergoing a very rigorous review of all of the provisions. The United States Trade Representative recently held a
My question, I'm sorry, I'm limited in time, forgive me. My question is direct. Is it the position of the State Department that abrogating the free trade agreement with South Korea would be helpful in our diplomatic efforts and in our efforts to respond to the North Korean threat at this time?
No, I think what we'd like to do is work to improve the trade agreement at the same time that we work with the South Koreans, obviously, on facing the North Korea.
Is it the policy of the State Department that the new president, President Moon of South Korea, is engaged in a policy of appeasement in any respect with respect to the North?
No, I think we've been working very hard to get the South Koreans to come around and be on the same page as we and the rest of our allies, and they've come around very nicely, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Billingsley, like you, I also served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and worked with your former boss, Mr. Helms. I was on the other side of the aisle, but we actually made a lot of music together sometimes, which always surprised the Reagan administration and the Bush administration afterwards. You talked a lot about China. So China's been violating, and you provided some graphic evidence of that, with impunity, violating sanctions, under other flags, shipping coal, and providing badly needed foreign exchange for the North Korea regime. They just signed on in this unanimous UN new round of sanctions. Do we have any reason to believe that that would signal a change in Chinese behavior for the better? Or is it another empty promise that will be violated with impunity?
To be determined.
Can you speak louder into your
Sorry,
microphone?
Congressman, it's to be determined. The reason I wanted to highlight for you the evasion schemes is that maritime enforcement now becomes crucial. With the 2 UN Security Council resolutions that are in effect not sanctions but embargoes, complete embargoes, at least on paper, of coal, iron, lead, now textiles, seafood, gasoline, maritime enforcement of those UN Security Council resolution decisions, which are binding on all members of the UN, that's going to be crucial going forward.
And if the chair would just indulge me one follow-up question. So at the end of the day, and I either or both of you can answer. So let's say we by tightening sanctions, which I favor, we get North Korea to the table saying, "Uncle, what do we give them in return? What are we prepared to do to entice North Korea that there's, a pot of something at the end of the rainbow if you freeze the program and start to reverse it under international observation?"
I think
Because isn't that the goal?
I'll just be quick. I mean, I think the Secretary of State's been pretty clear in public remarks that we'd be willing to look at economic enticements, at development opportunities for their economy, at their security concerns, and other things that we've talked about during negotiations with them in the past. And so I think all of that would be on the table, assuming we could get to, we don't want to pay for negotiations or negotiate to get to the negotiating table. That's where we are right now.
At the end of the day, I give you one word that has to guide U.S. foreign policy in all respects, but especially in North Korea. That word is efficacy, which is defined as the ability to produce a desired and intended result. And I think that's also to be determined, Mr. Billingsley. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. We now go to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to again thank you and the ranking member, as others have said, for your at least attempts to get sanctions work, tougher sanctions. I think it's something worthwhile to pursue. That being said, just one thing I wanted to make sure that I'm accurate on this. 90%, perhaps more, of what North Korea, the regime especially, needs to survive, they get from one source or another from China. Is that, I see a nodding. Ms. Thornton, would you agree with that also? Okay. That being said, obviously China's the key, has been for a long time, continues to be. It seems to me there are 2 things which could get China's attention. They've given us lip service for decades now. But one of those things is the trade with the U.S. is significant, and it seems that if we literally, some sanctions on banks, that may help a little bit, but it's not going to have the result, I think, that we all want, and that's to avoid military action and get North Korea to back off this march to madness in their nuclear program. So one way is if we actually did cut off trade. And of course, if we did that, would it have an adverse impact on the American economy? Of course it would. However, I'd say that pales in comparison to the impact on the American economy if we see a thermonuclear device go off in Seattle or San Francisco or LA or New York or Washington. So that's one thing that I think could actually get China's attention. I think the other thing, and Ms. Thornton, you sort of may have been at least thinking about this when you said that we're discussing with Japan and South Korea what they may want to move ahead on. And I don't know if this is what you had in mind or not, but it's certainly what I have in mind and have said this for years. They do not want Japan or South Korea to have their own nuclear programs. And I have thought for a long time that we should at least be discussing that with them, and I think the discussions alone could have gotten their attention to get them to put pressure on North Korea to back off. It may be too late for that now, but could you comment on those two items which perhaps could get China to actually put sufficient pressure on North Korea to back away from this madness?
Sure. Well, I mean, we are certainly looking at every option to put more pressure on China. We're also, using all of our global partners to speak up and also, from their perspectives, put pressure on China, because we do see China as the key to the solution of this problem, if we can get there. I think, as for cutting off trade, obviously that would be a huge step, and there are a lot of ramifications of that. I think going after entities and banks are a way of going more directly after the North Korean angle here, but I agree with you that trade is preferable to seeing any kind of military confrontation, especially one that would involve people in the United States. But on the issue of defenses in Japan and South Korea, we've certainly been talking to Japan and South Korea about beefing up their defenses and their ability to themselves take action in the event of an attack. And even those discussions have gotten China's attention. You probably know Chinese have been very vocal about their opposition to the THAAD deployment in South Korea, which we have moved ahead on now and gone ahead and deployed over and above their objections. And we have made clear that there's, the Japanese are seeking additional defensive systems to enable them to ward off a direct attack from North Korea. And it is quite clear, I think, already to the Chinese that this is an area that is going to be further developed if we can't rein in the threat from North Korea.
It's my view that short of one of those two actions, I think we're going to continue down this path where Kim Jong-un will continue to move forward on this nuclear program, and that'll leave only the option, the military option, which there's no good to come from that. We know if we take that action, they can target Seoul, and literally tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives could be lost, including American lives. So that's the last resort, although may ultimately come to that. Or the alternative that some people are suggesting now as well. We have a nuclear China, we have a nuclear Russia. We don't like that, so maybe we end up with a nuclear North Korea. Why can we not allow that to happen? How are they different?
A lot of times people talk about the North Koreans needing a nuclear program for their own defense. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's been basically a mutual deterrence in effect since the end of the Korean War. They have a conventional position that allows them to target Seoul. And so the idea that they need nuclear weapons for their own defense when there's never been a retaliation for any of their provocative or hostile or even kinetic actions that they've taken is a bit of a bridge too far, I think. So the concern is that they are pursuing a nuclear program in order to use that program to conduct blackmail and hold other countries hostage and continue to take even worse sorts of steps in their behavior. Proliferation is another major concern, of course. It undermines the entire global non-proliferation system and would be, we presume, ripe for sale and sort of proliferation around the world. So I think two major angles there.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to start with you, Ms. Thornton. You said we will never accept North Korea as a nuclear state. What did you mean by that? I mean, aren't they already a nuclear state?
No, we do not recognize them as a nuclear state. And
What does that mean?
We do not recognize them as a nuclear weapons state. We don't recognize their program, and we won't consider them to have nuclear weapons. We're pursuing denuclearization.
Well, the fact that we can't imagine it away. Either they're a nuclear state or they're not. The recognition of one, I'm not understanding that point. I mean, we have to have realistic context for, before we shape smart strategy.
Will the gentleman yield for just
Sure,
a
as
second?
long as you
Because
give me
there is
extra
an additional complexity here.
About delivery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to make that point.
No, I understand, but, okay, let me move on. Mr. Secretary, you said that UN Resolution 2371 prevents 55% of refined petroleum products from coming into North Korea, and the new sanctions prevent $500 million of coal, which leaves another $500 million of coal and about 45% of petroleum products. What am I understanding that our sanctions don't reach the balance of that, and if not, why not?
So, Congressman, a couple of things. So, all coal is prohibited to be transacted. That was under the prior.
Mr. Secretary, just pull the microphone a little closer.
So, Congressman, it is not allowed to trade in North Korean coal, period, nor in iron ore, lead ore, North Korean.
So those percentages relate to non-compliance.
The 55% number I gave you is kind of the fuzzy math done on how much gasoline versus crude oil is imported today into North Korea from China.
Okay, thank you. I think we've heard from a number of my colleagues in response to those questions about pretty clear non-compliance by the Chinese. The UN experts on North Korea in February found that they were using this livelihood exemption to trade banned goods and allow companies to send rocket components to North Korea. And you said, Ms. Thornton, and I think also, Mr. Secretary, that we need to see that happen, that is compliance by the Chinese. You described the Chinese as the center of gravity. And then, Ms. Thornton, you said if China doesn't comply with the sanctions, we will use the tools at our disposal. What are those tools, and why aren't we already using them? I mean, otherwise these sanctions sound good in a press release, but if they're not actually being honored by the parties, they're not effective, as Mr. Conley said. So what are the tools that you intend to use, and why aren't we already using them?
Well, one of the things to remember, I think Assistant Secretary mentioned this, is that North Korea has been under sanctions for many decades. So their networks, it's a criminal enterprise, and their networks are deeply embedded, and they have designed them to escape detection. So it is a little bit complicated to go after these things. But what I meant when I say using our tools, we have these international sanctions regimes. The international community signed up to it and is obliged to enforce that. We have a running discussion with many of the countries around the world on information we have about what we find as illicit networks, and ask them to go after those. If they don't, then we will use our domestic authorities to sanction those entities.
I guess my question is, I think most military experts would acknowledge that there is not a good military option. We can talk about it, but there actually isn't one. And so if we surrender the use of the sanctions regime to produce the result that we want by not using every tool that's available to us, aren't we in the end acquiescing to North Korea's nuclear capabilities?
Well, I think our strategy is to ramp up the sanctions regime, and that's exactly what we've been doing. We've had 2 unanimous UN Security Council resolutions in 2 months. That's unprecedented.
No, I understand that, but they have to be implemented in a meaningful way and fully. Otherwise, they're nice resolutions, but it sends the wrong message, it seems to me, to North Korea if they don't see that that's real engagement by the Chinese to make these sanctions work.
Right. But that's exactly what we're working on. And I think on sanctions regimes, a lot of people say the sanctions won't work either. But in past cases where we've used sanctions, I just want to note you're a chump if you're implementing sanctions and they're not working until you're a genius when they do.
No, I think sanctions do work if they're implemented. My last question is this. It seems to me that this suggestion that China is the center of gravity is right, and that the only way that we'll get China to fully implement the sanctions regime is for them to conclude that it's in their own interest to do that, and that will only happen when they arrive at the point that their fear of a unified Korean peninsula aligned with the United States is outweighed by their fear of a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, I think that's the calculation. And I guess my question is, what are the strategies that the administration is pursuing that bring China to that point where they conclude that it is in their interest to enforce the sanctions because the danger of a conflict on the peninsula is greater than their fear of some alignment by a unified Korean peninsula with the United States? Or do you agree or disagree with that assessment? And I'd ask Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right, and I think we've seen the Chinese moving, you know, in their system for them pretty swiftly toward a recalculation of what they're worried about on the Korean Peninsula. They see North Korea's actions undermining their own security through the beefing up of defenses in their region, and they're also seeing, you know, they're certainly very alarmed at North Korea's behavior and the explosion of the 6th nuclear test, a hydrogen bomb right on their border, is very concerning to them. So I think we see them moving in this direction. It's not fast enough or sort of deep enough for us to be satisfied, but we're certainly pushing them in that direction, and we have an ongoing conversation with them about this at the highest levels.
I would also add that, as the chairman has pointed out, the Banco, you know, the Banco Delta Asia sanctions had a crippling effect on the regime, but that was more than a decade ago. We have, for the first time in more than a decade, taken action against, in this case, a Chinese bank. This was Bank of Dandong. That was a very clear warning shot that the Chinese understood, and we are in repeated discussions with them that we cannot accept continued access to the international financial system by North Koreans through their financial networks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Mr. Ted Yoho is chairman of our Asia Pacific Subcommittee, and he joined us in South Korea and has passed legislation to improve our ability to get information actually into North Korea. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing today. North Korea's recent provocation are its most dangerous yet. In launching a ballistic missile over Japan and detonating its most powerful nuclear device to date, the Kim regime has shown it is more emboldened than ever before. Kim Jong-un says we're backed into a corner. However, I think he's wrong. He's getting into a decreasing corner by his actions, and we are on the outside of that corner looking in. But year after year, successive administrations have failed to fully implement the sanctions, and China continues underwriting DPRK's programs, either financially via trade, doing 90% of their trade, or through technological exchanges, as we've seen with the rocket North Korea launched up, and we recovered or not we, but the South Koreans recovered the second stage, and it was full of Chinese components. So China is complicit in this. The implementation of the secondary sanctions authorized by Congress has established that we've done over the past years is often controversial, but North Korea's nuclear technology has advanced. The need has become imminent. With these recent tests, implementation has become an existential need for millions of North Koreans, Japanese civilians, perhaps the United States, and really the world community. And I find myself agreeing with my colleague, Mr. Sherman, again, when he was talking about China. We've been here multiple times, his experience of 20 years in this committee, hearing the same story over and over again. And my questions are going to be focused on what do we do from this point forward? You two are both in the seat that you're watching this at a very close level of engagement. You know what is working, what is not working. How do we go forward so that we're not back here in a year discussing what we should have done? I want to know what we did do and what tools you need to move forward so that these sanctions really do work. Ranking Member Sherman and I both, we wrote a letter both to State and to the Treasury providing a list of Chinese banks that may have provided North Korean banks with indirect correspondence. And I'm happy to say that the State Department have sanctioned that recently, and China has been complicit with this and gone along with this. The Agricultural Bank of China and the China Construction Bank. These are great positive moves, but there are still 10 more banks that China can sanction or put pressure on to stop doing business with North Korea. And my question to you, do you guys have enough tools in your arsenal to make sure that the world community, because it can't be just us, and that's why sanctions haven't worked in the past, it has to be a buy-in from the world community, because this is something that's affecting all of the world community, to get to a point where we have diplomacy that works so that we don't have any kinetic conflicts. Certainly, this world does not want to see a nuclear device go off in a homeland of anybody's, and this is this generation's fight to make sure this doesn't happen. So, Ms. Thornton, is there anything else that you need that would make these other countries complicit with the sanctions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Subcommittee Chairman. We definitely believe that the UN Security Council actions are the most significant actions that we can take on the sanctions front, and that's because every country in the world is obligated to enforce those sanctions. It gives them the legal authority to do so, and it obliges them to do so. And it opens up a whole sphere of enforcement for us to work with other countries on. So I think the most significant actions in the UN, which UN Security Council, our representative, Ambassador Haley, has undertaken have been really key. The other key, I think, authorities are our domestic enforcement authorities, which back up the UN Security Council.
Let me stop you there and ask you this. You know, North Korea was on the state sponsor of terrorism, and certainly we can look at their acts that they've done. In fact, you said that North Korea was using intimidations, acts of intimidation. The word you use describe terrorism. So when we took them off the state sponsor of terrorism list, do you feel it would be important to put them back on that, and would it help toughen the sanctions and get compliance by the other countries?
Well, I think that state sponsor of terrorism is another statutory tool that we have, and certainly the Secretary is looking at that in the context of North Korea. I don't know that there are any authorities.
I'm about out of time. Would it be prudent for us to put them back on that list?
I don't know if there are additional authorities there that would give us additional tools to go after things. I think it would be just another layer, but we're certainly
another layer would
it.
be good, and I
Yeah.
appreciate your time, and I'm sorry I didn't get to you, Assistant Secretary. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We go now to Mr. Brad Schneider from Illinois, who was also with our delegation for our meetings with President Moon and other senior U.S. and South Korean officials during that time when the North Korean missile was shot over Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for leading that delegation. It was an extraordinary opportunity to understand the situation better, to understand the threat, but also to understand the strategy. And today we've talked a lot about strategy. We've talked about North Korea's strategy of accelerating their testing, trying to weaponize, put their miniaturize weapon and put it on a missile. We've talked a lot about U.S. strategy and working within our laws as well as the United Nations. The strategies follow goals, and we have had some discussion of our goals. If I could summarize our goals, it seems to be we're priority number one is to eliminate the nuclear threat by North Korea. Secondary goal is to bring stability to the peninsula. Ms. Thornton, you talked about what our goals are not. I just want to emphasize those. Not regime change or collapse, nor do we seek an accelerated reunification of Korea or an excuse to send troops north of the Armistice Agreement's military demarcation line. We have no desire to inflict harm on the long-suffering North Korean people, who we view as distinct from the hostile regime in Pyongyang. I think that's important. But I'd like to ask you is if you could succinctly describe what are North Korea's goals?
I think it's pretty hard to get inside the mind of the North Korean leader, but I think he's been fairly clear in public statements that he seeks to complete his nuclear weapons program in order to be able to sit down at the table with us as a sort of nuclear weapons fully developed state. And
Well, that
as
seems
a
part of
threat.
the strategy, but their long-term goals, Mr. Deputy Secretary.
I really do have to defer to State Department on this. My job is to drag them to the table through economic pressure, but I defer to State Department on how we go. from there.
I think that most experts on Korea would say that the main overarching goal, and I think one of the members mentioned the Juche philosophy, Representative Smith. I think that regime survival, regime perpetuation is pretty much an overarching purpose and goal.
Okay, that seems to be the shared collective wisdom. How about China? Because they have different goals, obviously, than ours in many ways. How would you describe their goals in this
I think
dynamic?
China's been also pretty clear in their public comments. They don't want chaos, war, or nukes on the Korean Peninsula. Those are their stated three main goals in this particular issue. Of course, they're also looking to maintain stability in their region and to create the conditions for further economic development.
Okay, so it seems that there's this shared perspective, at least between the U.S. and China, that achieving each of our respective goals, denuclearization, elimination of the nuclear threat, we should have. Sanctions are the path to put pressure on Korea. But how do we create, and this is a broad message maybe beyond here, but a clear message for North Korea that the only path for survival, the only path for them to achieve their goals is through denuclearization, that they are taking the wrong path? What off-ramps, what mechanisms can we provide to show them that the way they're headed is a risk to their regime, a dire risk to their regime, and every option being on the table, and that there is a different path, and that path is open to them?
Well, it's difficult to do this when they're shooting ICBMs, threatening Guam, and exploding hydrogen bombs on the border of China. But I think we've been very clear in our public statements that denuclearization is the goal. We have used both words and actions to try to drive them in the direction that we want them to go. Public statements by us, public statements by many of our partners and allies in messages directly to the North Korean regime, but also through public messaging, which the North Koreans definitely are picking up on, to tell them that this is denuclearization is the only path to survival for the regime, and we've been quite explicit about that. We're trying to show them that through our deterrence actions, through our sanctions actions, through our diplomatic actions, and I think they have a different view so far, but we're continuing to press on that.
And I don't mean this next question any other way than I'm asking. In the way I'm asking it really is a honest question. Is it better to have a very clear, consistent message that this is what you take these steps, this is what we do, or is it better in your mind to leave uncertainty and perhaps having a mix of messages?
Well, I think it's good to have consistent, clear messages, especially for a regime like North Korea that has a very opaque, communication system and difficulty probably for information to reach the top leader, which is why we use public messaging in some cases so that we can be sure that he can get it directly. But I think it's also important not to take any options off the table so that there is sufficient motivation for them to move toward the negotiating table.
Yeah, I would share that. And I'm out of time. I'll ask a question maybe for later someone else will touch on is we talked about the outside pressure and trying to get alignment with the U.S. and China in putting pressure on North Korea. But I would appreciate the opportunity for further discussion, how we create that internal pressure from within, not just making it harder for payment of the military, but for the public to understand what's really happening within North Korea, and in contrast, what the opportunities are without and pursuing that different path. And with that, I thank you for the extra time, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think you make a very important point in terms of that focus. And there's another element, I thought, with respect to the conversations we've had. This is the second time we've talked to a senior North Korean defector who said, no, they already have the ability. They're not afraid of South Korean attack or a North Korean attack because they've got a 1 million-man army on the border and 100,000 plus missiles and all the other hardware. What the issue is for North Korea is that they feel it's a illegitimate government in South Korea, that you know, at the founding of the Korean Peninsula, when the occupation was over from Japan, it should have been unified under the Kim dynasty. And the focus of the Kim regime, of Kim Jong-un, is on getting enough nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, that they can turn to Seoul and say, we are going to be reunified, but we're going to be doing it under the regime. I think that is interesting information in that it comes from those who, in one case, was the senior head of propaganda for the regime. And if that is indeed the calculus, it really complicates things in terms of the feelings of the Kim regime. But he seemed to indicate, both seemed to indicate, that although that was the focus of the Kim family, it may not necessarily be the focus of most North Koreans, who would understand, who tend to understand that drive to do that is what is costing the country its standard of living, its ability to give anyone else opportunity. It is solely in the interest of, you know, the megalomaniac that's currently in power. I think that concept is an interesting one when it's shared with us by those who are actually part of the North Korean regime. But I do think we need to begin the process of having hearings to dig deeper into this whole calculus.
And if I can, I think that's critically important. I couldn't agree more. And this is why I was talking about goals. If the goal is regime survival, that's strategy. There's an opportunity to have one direction. If the goal is the submission of South Korea, that's a different. The strategy can be the same with the development of nuclear weapons, but trying to create an opportunity for engagement is entirely different and much more challenging. So I think that is a critical conversation to have. Thank you.
Indeed. Mr. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank all of you for being here. And personally, I want to commend the President, frankly, for, I think, finally taking a tough perspective on North Korea. I think being very open about this is the challenge of our generation. We all know terrorism is a huge issue, but this is a bigger challenge, I think. This is an existential threat, I would say, to the United States, to world order, to denuclearization of the world, to nuclear proliferation. And as far as I see it, you know, there's a lot of folks, and whether it's here at the hearing or if you watch the media, they all say there's no military option. They say, well, there's a military option, but not really. It's unthinkable, so we'll never use it. And I look at it this way. In order to actually achieve our objectives, and we've almost accepted defeat even prior to actually going about these objectives in some circles, we have three areas. Number one is diplomacy, which we're, I think, very ramping up in a big way through economic use, through actual diplomacy, everything else. Number two is missile defense, which we would obviously need in the case that we have to defend ourselves. And number third is a military option. People that understand instruments of power and how they work, and the various instruments of power that our nation has, I think has to understand that you cannot do diplomacy with an adversary without a big stick to use, whether that's military, whether that's economic, whatever, that there has to be on the table basically the unthinkable in order to make diplomacy work. So number one, diplomacy is good, but if we're ruling out a credible military option, I think it's going to be unsuccessful ultimately. The idea of missile defense is great and we need it, but the reality is if we just back up and say, well, as long as we build a missile defense, North Korea will be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, I think that leads to massive proliferation around the world. I think how do you tell Iran that they can't have a nuclear weapon when the JCPOA is up actually fairly soon, when in fact you've just given North Korea de facto access to a nuclear weapon? So let me just I'll ask a question, Mr. Billingsley, to you. So when people go out and they say there really is no military option, even though it is unthinkable, and by the way, the military should be used in doomsday scenarios, of which I think this ranks up there with doomsday scenarios. Does that strengthen diplomatic hand? Does that strengthen your ability to get North Korea to the table, or does it weaken it?
I think we would be exceedingly unwise to take anything off the table. And I was a Senate staffer up here on a committee, on the Foreign Relations Committee, when the agreed framework was negotiated. And that was designed to freeze the Yongbyon reactor and so on. And we gave all kinds of heavy fuel oil under the Clinton administration. And look where we are now. So this administration has made very clear at the cabinet level and at the president himself that we're not going to kick this can down the road. We can't. He's testing advanced nuclear designs and ICBMs. It is a matter of time now before he mates the warhead to the missile and poses an existential threat, not just to our friends and allies, but to us.
Let me ask you a question to follow up. As a prior administration official said, and I don't like to throw stones at past administrations, so I'm not doing that. But as this person wrote in an op-ed, we have to just live with a nuclear North Korea. In essence, for me, saying that the prior administration was willing to work with live with a nuclear North Korea. Let me ask you a question. If we say, as long as we have missile defense, we're unwilling to do what's difficult for North Korea, we're unwilling to engage in economic action against the Chinese, push the Chinese back in their territorial disputes in the South China Sea, whatever. If we do that, can you talk about what the rest of the world will look like when we de facto accept North Korea as even if we don't say we've accepted them, if we de facto accept them, what does that do when the JCPOA runs out of time? What does that do to South Korea, Japan, other countries' nuclear ambitions? And what does that do to our moral authority to enforce the nuclear non-proliferation?
Well, I'll defer to State Department on sort of the broader implications, but I would tell you we are not willing to live with a nuclear North Korea. North Korea has proven that they are certainly willing to share nuclear technology with all manner of pariah regimes to sell capabilities. I think Ambassador Bolton just had an op-ed where he pointed out it was a recent anniversary of the Israeli strike on a Syrian nuclear facility, which was alleged to have been constructed with North Korean support, for instance. So these are big issues. We are determined to induce the Chinese to help solve this problem.
Well, let me commend you on that. And Ms. Thornton, I'd give you time. I'm out, so I'm not ignoring you. I just, the clock ran. But let me say at the end, to reiterate what the Secretary said, I couldn't imagine in the situation that Syria is in today, which I think is tragic, and I think there's been a lack of action on our part to fix that. I couldn't imagine, had they had a nuclear program, what we'd be looking at today. And there's a lot of concern of social instability in North Korea. Someday, look, people don't like to be oppressed. They won't be oppressed, even in a place like North Korea. What happens someday when that government is destabilized and you see something? I think these are all very important questions. And again, I want to commend you and the administration and the State Department for their hard work on this issue, and I yield back.
We'll go to Congresswoman Norma Torres of California.
Thank you once again, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us together for this very, very important and critical issue that we have here in dealing with North Korea and all of the problems that they have caused most recently. I think we pretty much all agree that there is no magic bullet in dealing with this regime. And I think that we pretty much are in agreement that so far, all the sanctions and everything that we have done hasn't worked. So where have we gone wrong? I don't know. Part of that, we are trying to address here. I think that we have to be pretty realistic that this regime that we're dealing with is willing to do anything, put its people and the entire world at risk in order to achieve what they ultimately want to achieve, and that is a nuclear weapon that would come far enough to reach American citizens. And, we've been talking a lot and calling out Los Angeles. I represent LA County, San Francisco. We haven't really mentioned Hawaii, which is a lot closer, and our territories. Another issue I think that we have neglected to address, and that is the consumer issue. We haven't really engaged consumers and a more global inclusion to deal with North Korea and China's appetite to have slave-type workers working in their companies. So as a consumer, when I'm buying products, where is that chain of where this product was made and who it was made by? We know that many of our products are made in China, but not by whom. correct? So to me, the bigger issue is, are we hitting the right targets? Are we being surgically enough to inflict the maximum pain on the regime versus inflicting the maximum pain on the people of North Korea? Congresswoman Wagner and I have introduced the North Korea Follow the Money Act, H.R. 3261, which would direct the Director of National Intelligence to produce a national intelligence estimate of the revenue sources of the North Korean regime. My hope is that this bill will make our sanctions policy more precise and a bit more effective, but I think that we still cannot get away from engaging more people. If foreign governments are not willing to engage, everyone's interested in the doomsday clock. It was advanced by another 30 seconds in January, and I think that we missed another opportunity to talk about what is happening in the Korean area more closely. I'd like to ask if you would agree that a clear picture of North Korea revenues, if we need to have a better picture of North Korean revenues in order for our sanctions to be more effective.
So, Congresswoman, you are always going to find that I and the Treasury Department are interested in more intelligence, not less. We are an intelligence-driven organization, and the more precise information that can be generated, the better. I would say that back to your point about opportunities missed, we're at the point now where enforcement is crucial. We have the various UN Security Council resolutions. In the past, it was sometimes very difficult to judge the proper enforcement of these different provisions because they weren't complete embargoes. So you could get into arcane arguments about
the best embargo that you can get is for the consumer to be more informed and for the consumer to say, I will no longer purchase any good that comes from this country because 100%. They are failing to support us in ensuring that we have a nuclear safe world.
Agree 100%. And I would highlight two particular areas. You talked about labor. One of the successes that Ambassador Haley has had at the UN is getting past this idea that, well, we would just cap North Korean labor at whatever level it is, the slave labor in these various countries. We're now, under the new resolution passed last night, this is going to be wound down. That's important. Seafood is the other area to really talk to consumers about, to make sure that we go after any efforts to smuggle North Korean seafood into.
Can you give me an estimate of what percentage of North Korean revenues are from illicit sources?
At this stage, virtually all revenue is now illicit and illegal because the UN Security Council has banned just about every single.
So what are our options in dealing with that?
Maritime enforcement. The single most important thing we can do is enforce a complete prohibition on the sale of North Korean raw materials.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
We go now to Congressman Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I think always when we make big decisions, we should look at history. My understanding is that the Russians, Stalin, put the Kim regime in power, first to invade the South, in my opinion, to prevent the West being aware of what's taking place in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union kept moving through and taking that area. We've had 3 Kims in charge. They've all been very belligerent. They've all committed crimes, going all the way back to the hijacking of the Pueblo, to the KLL Flight 858, the attempted assassination of the South Korean president. They have a history of doing bad things. But it's always been the goal that they feel entitled because they are put there by Stalin to be in charge of North Korea. And as the chairman said, they want to conquer the South. The war has never ended. It's a ceasefire or a truce or agreement. There's no treaty involved. And we've been played by the Kims for years. They talk about causing war, nuclear capability, and the West says, oh, we'll pay you not to do that if you promise to be nice. And so they promise not to declare war on anybody. They take our money, supposedly to feed their starving people, and then what do? A few years later, they do the same thing. And this has been going on all the way back to the Clinton administration. They understand one thing, that the West, the United States, can be bought off if they just make a lot of noise about doing bad things to the rest of us. We should understand that. We should understand that being nice and saying that we will take care of you and be and encouraging them in a diplomatic way to not declare war has not worked. And I'm not saying we ought to go to war. I'm just saying that's what they understand. So this president's taken a different point of view. He's talking in a language that I think little Kim can understand, that those days are over. And I commend Ambassador Nikki Haley for her work in getting these two latest rounds of sanctions through the UN. The idea that the Chinese and the Russians are going to agree to sanctions on North Korea, I think that is a stroke of genius. I don't know how she did that, especially the Russians. Who started all of this was Stalin back in 1950. So I want to know what our options are, not just one. I want to know where we're going. You know, we all want sanctions. Well, sanctions. They hadn't really done much to stop anything, but we want sanctions, and we want more sanctions, and we want little Kim to stop this. But what if he doesn't stop it? What's the U.S.'s plan? And surely the U.S. has a contingency plan down the road. What is it? Y'all looking at each other. What's the contingency plan? Sure, we want sanctions. We want to cripple the economy. We want them to stop the slave trade. We want to do all those things. But what if he doesn't? Because little Kim, he's just he doesn't think like we do. So what are the rest of the options?
So thank you. Yes, Mr. Congressman. I think, we have a strategy. I mean, you all have heard from the Secretary, from other secretaries.
What is it?
Secretaries. It's the pressure strategy. We want to solve this through a negotiated settlement peacefully, but we are not taking any options off the table.
Which are?
You understand.
I only have a minute, so you have to kind of cut to the chase. What are the other options?
Options to use force, options to use sanctions pressure to choke off the regime's revenues, et cetera, to get them to come to the negotiating table. And I think, we've been very clear about the strategy. We're not going to pay for negotiations, as been done previously, as you mentioned, in past history when we've dealt with the regime. They've sought payoffs, and we've made it very clear, the President and the Secretary, that we're not going to go down that road this time. We're going to band together with the coalition of global partners to choke off all of their economic revenue. And if
so we have a military option down the road if nothing works.
Sure.
Would you agree with that,
Yes.
Assistant Secretary?
Absolutely. And I've said we're not going to take any of those options off the table.
I would additionally offer at a much more, very precise level, and you'll see it in my full written remarks, but we're targeting two things here. We're targeting his access to hard currency because he needs these dollars for his WMD and missile programs. And we're targeting the way he still has access to the international financial system. We need to rip that out root and stem. And that's what we're focused on, is shutting down his access to hard currency through these new UN embargoes that Ambassador Haley has successfully gotten in place. These are total cutoffs. You cannot trade in North Korean coal. That is a huge percentage of the revenue left to this dictator, given that we actually have relatively well shut off his arms trade and a number of the other things he was trading in. He's basically been reduced to high volume, low margin commodities, minerals, things like that, and we have to choke that off. But secondly, because of lack of enforcement in the international system by countries we've talked about, China today, Russia, he still has access to the international financial system because he has North Korean brokers and agents operating with impunity brazenly abroad in foreign jurisdictions. That has to stop. And so that is our next step.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time.
Mr. Ted Lieu of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, thank you to the witnesses for your public service. I served on active duty under U.S. Pacific Command in the 1990s at Guam. We did a whole series of different exercises. Most of them were directed at North Korea. And it was very clear there were no good military options. And the reason I bring that up is because diplomatic and economic options depends on whether, in fact, you have a good military option. And often it's not for us to say. It's dictated by the facts on the ground. And if we do have amazingly great military options, then we might do less diplomacy and less economic sanctions. But if we really have no good options militarily, then you might have to double down on what you're doing. So I think it's important to just walk through some of those not so very good military options. And let me start with this question. The Trump administration's goal is to denuclearize North Korea. That's correct, right? But we don't know how many nuclear weapons they have. Isn't that correct? Say that again?
Yeah, we have estimates.
You have estimates. And we also don't know where all those nuclear weapons are, correct? They're pretty good at hiding them.
They're good at hiding things.
Right. So in order to get rid of those weapons, to get the Trump administration's goal through military force, we would need a ground invasion, find those weapons, and destroy them. Isn't that correct?
Get the connection?
Right. Since we don't know what the nuclear weapons are, we don't know how many they have, in order to denuclearize North Korea through a military option, we would need a ground invasion to find those weapons and destroy them. Isn't that correct?
I suspect we'd need our Department of Defense colleagues here to really, truly answer that.
No, I understand, but for you to do your job, you also need to understand the military option, right? So let me just go on. North Korea also has the knowledge to build nuclear weapons. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And they've got the knowledge to build ICBMs. And you can't unlearn that. So to keep them from doing this in the future, we would need to occupy the country, or have South Korea or one of our allies occupy the country and keep them from doing this again in the future. Isn't that correct, if we would do this through military force?
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily, and again, I'm putting my old Pentagon treaty negotiator hat on, but there are countries that have abandoned their nuclear programs and their missile ambitions. South Africa is a good example. Argentina is a good example. So there are examples.
After the use of military force?
Actually,
no,
prior
right?
to.
Through other means. I mean, I can understand North Korea giving up or freezing the nuclear weapons if we apply economic or diplomatic pressure. But I'm saying if we were to use military force and they're going to resist it, and then to keep them from doing nuclear weapons in the future, we would need regime change to occupy the country. At least that's my sense. I don't know how we otherwise would do that. So let's just step away from nuclear weapons. They've also got about 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. Isn't that correct?
They do have chemical weapons,
okay.
Yes.
And then they have this massive conventional arsenal of rockets and artillery and so on, correct? And they can launch all of that at South Korea. They can use missiles against Japan. They can use missiles against Guam, where we've got hundreds of thousands of Americans in those three areas, correct? And with millions of civilians in all those areas, correct? So with any military option, we wouldn't be able to contain escalation. Isn't that correct?
It's all hypothetical. So I think it depends on things that are happening, and it depends on a lot of other scenarios. But you're telling the story, so go ahead.
Okay. So Defense Secretary Mattis has said basically there are no good military options, and the options would be very ugly, which then leads me to believe that your job is very critical. We essentially have diplomacy and economic sanctions. It seems like if we're going to pursue diplomacy, might it not be a good idea to have an ambassador to South Korea that can help us?
Yes.
Okay. Where are we with that? Why hasn't the president nominated an ambassador to South Korea?
We're working on it. I know the secretary spoke to this the other day. I think we're working on it.
I'm just saying it does send the message that we're not pursuing diplomacy seriously. and that we're also disrespecting our critical ally, South Korea. And I urge the Trump administration to get its act together and nominate an ambassador to South Korea. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. We go now to Mr. Lee Zeldin of New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. I believe that the administration has done a great job over the course of the first several months in office in making new strides in bringing China to the table, to bring Russia to the table, to ramp up sanctions effort, to have more multilateral diplomacy, to have increased economic pressure, to engage in further information campaigns within North Korea that didn't exist previously. And I think Ambassador Haley especially deserves a whole lot of credit for her hard work at the United Nations with the success that she has achieved there. And we wish her nothing but the best. Some of our colleagues have spoken about the idea of not using a military option. I think we all should agree that the military option should be the last possible option that we would be using after everything else were to fail. But some of my colleagues would go a little bit further, almost to suggest taking the military option off of the table. And I think from some of the other testimony here in your answers, there is certainly an agreement amongst others who would disagree, believing that having the military option on the table is one that helps with multilateral diplomacy and increased economic pressure and all of the other efforts. So it would not be wise, it would be unwise to take the military option off of the table. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what that red line is. And has the administration taken a public position on a red line? Should it? Do you believe we should have one? What does it look like? Because for me, the red line should be that North Korea should not have the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States. And there's still a component of their development that appears to not be there. The chairman got to it a little bit earlier as he was engaging one of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle as far as surviving reentry. So we're pursuing the diplomacy angle, we're pursuing the economic angle and the information angle, thinking of military options as the last possible option, preparing the whole slate of conventional to unconventional military options. What's that red line?
Well, the Assistant Secretary and I are here representing the economic sanctions lever and the diplomatic levers in this, and I've said that we're determined to pursue a peaceful resolution through a negotiated settlement. Of course, we're not taking any options off the table. We realize this is a very difficult problem, has been outlined by the Congressman Liu here. So I think what I would say about red lines, I mean, we and the Secretary of State are determined to use this pressure campaign to get the North Korean regime to change its path and to come to the negotiating table with a serious set of proposals on denuclearization. How we verify that, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization is what we're seeking through a negotiated settlement. I think we have a lot more room to go to squeeze them and increase the pressure of the international community, and I think we're continuing to see that that strategy is working, that the North Koreans are feeling that pressure, and we are focused on getting them back to the table. So I think as far as red lines go for a military option, I would certainly want to defer that question to some future point where we're not as much engaged in the diplomatic and economic pressure part of the campaign.
I personally believe that when the president said that North Korea would be met with fire and fury, that if North Korea were to attack the United States, they would be met with fire and fury. I was not offended by any means, and I believe that Kim Jong-un needs to know, and as someone who is homicidal, not suicidal, he needs to know that he would be putting himself and his regime at great risk by attacking us. There's a lot of hard work that's been done by the administration, doubling down, tripling down, and quadrupling down, making a lot of progress, great progress, specifically at the United Nations. I would just say if we truly want to prevent North Korea from having the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States, they are getting so much closer to it that if we are actually serious about that military option, that we're going to have to start seriously having that discussion, because that may be imminent. I yield back.
Mr. Mike McCall, who also chairs the Committee on Homeland Security.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And yeah, I view this as actually probably one of the biggest threats to the homeland. If they are capable of delivering an ICBM with a nuclear warhead to either Guam or the mainland of the United States. I know, looking back historically, A.Q. Khan and his network, this access between Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea, once Pakistan got it, we couldn't take it away. Iran, we had our negotiations, and now it looks like North Korea has it. And I think once a country has this capability, it's very difficult to take it away. So I don't envy your positions in terms of trying to negotiate our way out of this. And I think the last previous administrations have failed to get us to that point, and now we are where we are. And I think Iran is probably watching this whole thing play out in terms of what's their next step going to be as well. I'm not going to get into military options. I know it's not your expertise. I do think cyber should be looked at as something that could be done to shut them down. And I know we have tremendous capability in that regard. But my question is, and I know it's been talked a lot about Russia and China. Are they going to cooperate with these sanctions, and how much leverage is China putting on North Korea? But my question really has to go to the more illicit side of the house. Kim Jong-un has this North Korean Office 39 that sells basically drugs, illegal exports of minerals, as you mentioned, counterfeit cigarettes, a lot of other things. What are we doing to try to counteract that? And also, when it comes to proliferation and the sale of arms, can you tell me how much do you estimate North Korea is making off proliferation to countries like Iran and Syria?
Congressman, it's good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
So one of the things that's very important to underscore is that the Treasury Department and the authorities we wield are not, as you know from your time with the Department of Justice, they are not just sanctions. Sanctions is one of many tools we have. What we used to, in effect, collapse the Bank of Dandong was not a sanction. It was a Patriot, Section 311 under the Patriot Act action to root out the North Koreans in that bank. In terms of the proliferation of weaponry, because of previous UN Security Council resolutions, we have been able to dry up much of the illicit sales that they were engaged in to various African regimes and so on. There are still several transactions that they periodically float that we are actively engaging various countries to deter signing of contracts and going down that road. It would be very unwise for them to take these actions. We are in a full court press on this. Because of the success that Ambassador Haley and the State Department have had at the UN, in effect, you were asking about sort of illicit transactions. In effect, nearly every export coming out of North Korea today, as of last night, nearly every export is now illicit. Textiles are now illicit. You cannot trade in North Korean textiles. You cannot trade in basic minerals anymore. Under the previous administration, talking about Bureau 39, one of the things they would do is sell these huge overpriced bronze statues, and then the weapons were the kicker on the side, and sort of as a little sweetener for paying 6 times the going rate for a bronze statue. So that organization, the Mansadeh Fine Arts Studio, was sanctioned, and under our administration, we've started rooting out the rest of that particular arts and monuments revenue-generating schema. North Korean labor is another category that they're getting significant money from, and with the results last night, there's now not a freeze or cap on North Korean laborers. There's a requirement to wind it down. I'm not a big fan of wind downs because it's real hard to verify that, but that is nevertheless a a big step forward, and we intend to enforce that as well. I have reiterated on multiple occasions with counterparts in the Gulf and elsewhere that we need to see the North Koreans gone. The Department of State has been very active on this front, and we are seeing a drying up of revenue associated with the slave labor that the North Koreans employ.
It's actually, and then to my last question, North Korea proliferating weapons to Iran and Syria.
So we do track any kind of illicit proliferation networks from the North Koreans and go after those transactions, again, with colleagues at Treasury and other agencies in the U.S. government. When we find them, we try to block them or deter them, and we've had some success. It's a continuing effort on our part, and we devote a lot of attention to that in our Bureau of Nonproliferation.
But it is happening.
I think there are transactions that we are worried about, yes.
Okay. And I know some of that may be in another setting than this. So thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I thank you for answering the members' questions here today. I'm sure more of those questions will be submitted for the record for you to answer. There are a few issues that are urgent for us, but I don't think any of them are more urgent than the North Korean threat at this time. And to its credit, the administration recognized this early on. Secretary Tillerson's first focus as Secretary of State was North Korea. And he has been extensively engaged working with allies in the region while pressuring China and Russia and other countries that are funding the Kim regime. We need more sanctions, tougher sanctions. We need to supercharge this right now. And the administration is moving in the right direction, and China each day is rethinking the cost of its financial support for North Korea. The administration's focus on Korean slave labor abroad is very good. Sanctions are just one element of power we need to bring to bear. We need to stop giving only lip service to the power of information inside North Korea, broadcasting information in to change attitudes and conditions in North Korea. We simply aren't doing this well enough, and it must be a priority. And again, thank you for your testimony. We look forward to your follow-up, and this hearing stands adjourned.